You know that feeling when your best friend forces you to read a book that makes you want to throw your Kindle out the window? Yeah, that was me 3 weeks ago. Sarah, my college roommate and self-proclaimed romance novel connoisseur, had been pestering me for months to read The Duke's Crimson Rose. It's a masterpiece, she'd gushed, waving the book around like some sort of literary flag. The angst, the passion, the drama. What she failed to mention was that it was also a masterpiece of stupidity. The plot was your typical historical romance garbage. Duke Eldrick Blackthorne, brooding and mysterious, falls for the plucky commoner Rose Whitmore, who's not like other girls because she reads books and has opinions. Revolutionary stuff, really. But what made me want to scream into my pillow wasn't the predictable romance, it was Lady Evangeline Ashworth. Sweet, innocent. 8-year-old Evangeline. The Duke's ward. A literal child who was treated like dirt by everyone in the story for absolutely no reason, other than to make the main characters look better by comparison. She was ticked around, ignored, blamed for things that weren't her fault, and basically served as an emotional punching bag for 400 pages of manufactured drama. And for what? So that Rose could look more virtuous by occasionally showing her basic human decency, so that the Duke could have dramatic moments of protecting people while completely failing to protect the actual child in his care? The worst part, none of it mattered. The Duke and Rose broke up spectacularly in the end anyway, making all of Evangeline's suffering completely pointless. She was just collateral damage in their toxic relationship. I'd ranted about this to Sarah for hours. She's 8 years old. What kind of psychopath writes a helpless child being emotionally abused for entertainment? Sarah had just shrugged. It's fiction, Emma. Chill. Right. Tell that to my blood pressure every time little Evangeline got blamed for breathing too loudly. So naturally, when I woke up in a frilly pink dress in what was clearly a historical setting, my first thought wasn't, oh my God, I've been transported to another world. It was, oh my God, I'm going to murder Sarah. The realization hit me like a horse-drawn carriage, which, given my current location, was probably a legitimate concern. I was standing in an ornate bedroom that I recognized from the book's descriptions: silk wallpaper, mahogany furniture, and a portrait of some dead guy in a powder wig glaring down at me. But the real clincher was catching my reflection in the vanity mirror. Blonde ringlets, enormous blue eyes, a face that screamed, I'm 8 years old and about to have a very bad time. I was Lady Evangeline Ashworth. The universe's idea of a practical joke, apparently. Lady Evangeline. A sharp voice cut through my existential crisis. What are you doing dawdling? His Grace is expecting you in the library for your lessons. A stern-looking woman in a gray dress, Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, my brain supplied unhelpfully, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. In the book, she was one of Evangeline's primary tormentors, constantly berating the child for imaginary transgressions. Well, not on my watch. I straightened my shoulders and gave her my best adult, trying to look dignified in a child's body expression. Of course, Mrs. Hartwell, I was just preparing myself mentally for the intellectual stimulation ahead. She blinked. Apparently, 8-year-old Evangeline wasn't usually quite so verbose. Don't be impertinent, child, she snapped, but there was uncertainty in her voice. His Grace doesn't tolerate tardiness. Then by all means, let's not keep his broodiness waiting, I muttered under my breath as I followed her down the hallway. The Duke's mansion was exactly as pretentious as I'd imagined. All dark wood, expensive paintings, and the general ambiance of, I have more money than God, and the personality of a funeral. Mrs. Hartwell knocked on the library door. Lady Evangeline, your Grace. Enter. And there he was. Duke Eldrick Blackthorne, in all his fictional glory. Tall, dark, and glowering, sitting behind, offended by the existence of joy. His black hair was perfectly styled, his jaw could cut glass, and his eyes were the color of a stormy sky. You know, all that romance novel nonsense. In the book, this was where Evangeline would typically cower and stammer, while he ignored her existence. where she'd sit quietly through lessons while he made cutting remarks about her intelligence and breeding. Yeah, that wasn't happening. Ah, Duke Blackthorn, I said cheerfully, plopping myself into the chair across from his desk with all the dignity of a sack of potatoes. Lovely morning, isn't it? Perfect weather for traumatizing children, I imagine. He looked up from his papers, and I swear I saw his eye twitch. I beg your pardon? Oh, nothing, I said innocently, swinging my little legs since they didn't reach the floor. I was just commenting on the weather. Though I suppose when you spend all your time brooding in dimly lit rooms, you wouldn't know much about that. The silence stretched on for several heartbeats. Mrs. Hartwell made a strangled noise behind me. Lady Evangeline, the Duke said slowly, are you feeling quite well? Oh, I'm feeling fantastic, I chirped. Never better, actually. Though I do have some questions about my education. Questions? He set down his quill, giving me his full attention for what was probably the first time in little Evangeline's life. Yes, well, I was wondering, in between lessons on deportment and watercolors, will we be covering any practical skills? You know, like how to manage an estate, basic accounting, legal matters? Or are we sticking to the traditional, how to be decorative and useless curriculum? Mrs. Hartwell gasped audibly. The Duke's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. You are 8 years old, he said, as if this explained everything. A tragic condition that will resolve itself with time, I replied solemnly. But my brain works just fine, thank you. In fact, I'd argue it works better than most of the adults in this house, considering none of you seem capable of treating a child with basic human decency. And there it was, the conversation that was never going to happen in the original book. The moment when someone finally called out the casual cruelty that everyone just accepted as normal. The Duke stared at me like I'd suddenly sprouted a second head, which, given the circumstances, would have been less shocking than a coherent argument coming from his previously silent ward. Furthermore, I continued, warming to my theme, I've been thinking about my position in this household. Legally speaking, as your ward, you have certain responsibilities toward my well-being and education. I'd like to see the paperwork regarding my guardianship, my inheritance, and the terms of my parents' will. You would like to see paperwork? His voice was flat with disbelief. I'm surprisingly literate for someone who's been systematically ignored and undermined, I said cheerfully. Amazing what a child can accomplish when they're not being constantly told they're worthless. Mrs. Hartwell looked like she was about to faint. The Duke looked like he was reconsidering his life choices. Where, he asked carefully, is this coming from? I tilted my head, considering how to answer that without sounding completely insane. Let's just say I had something of an epiphany. A moment of clarity, if you will. I realized that I don't have to accept being treated poorly just because I'm young and dependent on your goodwill. I see. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with those storm-gray eyes. And what precisely do you propose to do about it? I smiled sweetly. Well, Your Grace, I propose we have a little chat about expectations. Mutual respect. And the fact that if you continue to allow your staff to treat me like an inconvenience, I might just have to start treating this guardianship like the legal contract it actually is. The silence that followed was the kind that makes you wonder if you've accidentally declared war. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine that can best be described as controlled mayhem. The original Evangeline had been a quiet, timid child who tried desperately not to be noticed. I, on the other hand, had decided that if I was going to be stuck in this ridiculous story, I might as well make it interesting. My first order of business was dealing with the household staff, who had apparently made tormenting a small child their favorite pastime. Mrs. Hartwell, in particular, seemed to take personal offense to my newfound backbone. Lady Evangeline, she snapped during breakfast, you will eat your porridge and stop making faces. I looked down at the gray, lumpy substance in my bowl. In the book, Evangeline was always given the worst food while everyone else ate properly. Today's porridge looked like it had been scraped off the bottom of someone's shoe. Hartwell, I said pleasantly, I couldn't help but notice that this porridge bears a striking resemblance to wallpaper paste. Is this intentional, or should I be concerned about the cook's eyesight? The other servants at their table went silent. Mrs. Hartwell's face turned an interesting shade of purple. "You ungrateful child." "Actually," I interrupted, standing up in my chair to address the room, "I've been doing some thinking about gratitude, and I realized that gratitude should be reciprocal. You're grateful for your employment. I'm grateful for food that doesn't qualify as a war crime. Everyone wins." I picked up my bowl and walked over to the servants' table, where Cook was enjoying what appeared to be actual eggs and toast. "Cook," I said brightly, "I don't suppose you'd mind terribly if I had some of what you're having?" I promised to be appropriately grateful for food that doesn't violate the laws of nature. Cook, who is a round, motherly woman named Mrs. Davies, looked between me and Mrs. Hartwell with obvious distress. In the book, she was one of the few people who showed Evangeline any kindness, though she was usually too intimidated to do much. I suppose," she stammered. "Excellent," before anyone could protest. I'd swapped my bowl of paste for a plate of perfectly normal breakfast food. See? Problem solved through the magic of reasonable communication. Mrs. Hartwell looked apoplectic. "Lady Evangeline, return to your seat this instant." "Why?" I asked, taking a bite of actually edible food. "I'm eating breakfast at the breakfast table. Technically, I'm exceeding expectations. His Grace will hear about this. Please do tell him," I said, cheerfully. "I'm sure he'll be fascinated to learn about the household management strategies that involve feeding children industrial paste." The thing about being 8 years old, I was discovering, was that adults didn't quite know how to handle a child who argued back with logic. They were prepared for tantrums, tears, and sulking. They were not prepared for calm, rational discourse from someone who barely reached their waist. Later that morning, I was summoned to the Duke's study. He was sitting behind his desk again, looking like he'd aged several years since our last conversation. "Lady Evangeline," he began, then paused. "Sit." I perched on the edge of the chair, swinging my legs cheerfully. "Good morning, Your Grace. Lovely day for bureaucratic discussions, don't you think? Mrs. Hartwell informs me that you've been difficult." "Define difficult," I said, "because if expecting basic human decency counts as difficult, then yes, I'm absolutely terrible." He rubbed his temples. "You cannot simply commandeer the servant's breakfast." "I didn't commandeer anything," I protested. "I engaged in a voluntary exchange of goods and services, economics in action." "You are 8 years old." "You keep saying that like it's an argument," I pointed out. "Age doesn't make mistreatment acceptable. If anything, it makes it worse." He stared at me for a long moment. "Where did you learn to speak like this?" "Books," I said, which was technically true. Amazing what you can pick up when you're not being constantly told to sit quietly and look decorative. "I never told you to. Your Grace," I interrupted. "With respect, you've never told me anything. We've had exactly 2 conversations in the 3 years I've lived in this house, and both of them have been this week." Another uncomfortable silence. I was getting good at those. "You want to discuss my responsibilities as your guardian?" he said finally. "Among other things, yes." He opened a drawer and pulled out several documents. "Very well. Your parents' will appointed me as your guardian until you come of age. Your inheritance includes a considerable estate in Somerset, which is currently being managed by my steward." I leaned forward, interested despite myself. "How considerable?" "Approximately £15,000 per year." I blinked. That was actually a lot of money. Like, never have to worry about anything ever again money. And where has this money been going? "The estate's income covers your living expenses and education, with the remainder invested for your future." "I see. And who's been overseeing these investments?" "My man of business." "Excellent. I'd like to meet with him." The Duke's eyebrows shot up. "You want to meet with my man of business?" "Well, they're my investments, aren't they? Seems reasonable that I should know what's being done with my money." "You are 8 years old, yes, we've established that, but it's still my money. I gave him my most innocent smile. Unless you're suggesting that there's something wrong with the accounts that you don't want me to see. The look he gave me could have frozen the Thames in July. Are you accusing me of embezzlement? Oh, goodness no, I said quickly. I'm sure everything is perfectly legitimate. I'm just interested in learning about estate management. You know, practical skills for when I inherit. Surely you want me to be prepared? He was quiet for so long I started to wonder if he'd fallen asleep with his eyes open. Very well, he said finally. I'll arrange a meeting. Wonderful. Oh, and while we're on the subject of my education, I've been thinking about getting a proper governess. You have a governess, Miss Pritchard. I snorted. Miss Pritchard spends half her time gossiping with the other servants and the other half telling me that my only goal in life should be to find a husband. I'm 8, Your Grace. I think we can delay the husband-hunting lessons for a few years. What would you prefer to learn? Languages, mathematics, history, literature, natural sciences. You know, the subjects that might actually be useful. I paused. And perhaps some lessons in estate management, since I'll be running my own property someday. The Duke was looking at me like I was a particularly complex puzzle he couldn't solve. You have given this considerable thought. I have a lot of time to think, considering no one talks to me. Another direct hit. He winced slightly. I will look into finding you a more suitable governess. Thank you. I hopped down from the chair. Oh, and Your Grace, about Mrs. Hartwell. What about her? If she continues to treat me like something unpleasant she stepped in, I'm going to start documenting it. And then I'm going to write letters to all your friends and business associates, asking their advice on household management. You know, as a learning exercise. His eyes narrowed. You wouldn't. I gave him my sweetest smile. I'm 8 years old, Your Grace. What do I know about social propriety and discretion? The expression on his face was absolutely priceless. 3 days later, I was introduced to Miss Adelaide Thornton, my new governess. She was nothing like the timid, gossipy Miss Pritchard. Tall and elegant, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp green eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, she looked like she could teach mathematics to a stone and make it understand. Lady Evangeline, she said, settling into the schoolroom with an armload of books that looked refreshingly advanced. His Grace tells me you have some very specific educational goals. I do indeed, Miss Thornton. I want to learn everything I can about running an estate, managing investments, and generally being useful. Also, I'd like to speak at least 3 languages fluently by the time I'm 16. She raised an eyebrow. Ambitious. I have time. Very well. We'll begin with Latin this morning, followed by mathematics, then history. This afternoon we'll work on French, and I've arranged for you to meet with His Grace's steward tomorrow to discuss estate management. I could have kissed her, a competent adult who took me seriously. It was like finding a unicorn. Miss Thornton, I said, I think we're going to get along splendidly. And we did. Miss Thornton was exactly what I needed. Someone who challenged me intellectually and treated me like a person instead of a problem to be managed. Under her tutelage, I threw myself into learning with the enthusiasm of someone who finally had something productive to do with their time. The household, meanwhile, was adjusting to the new reality of an Evangeline who had opinions and wasn't afraid to express them. Mrs. Hartwell had backed off considerably after our breakfast incident, though she still watched me with the suspicious air of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. Cook, bless her, had started making sure I got proper meals without me having to stage elaborate food swaks. The other servants seemed uncertain how to treat me now that I was no longer the convenient scapegoat for everything that went wrong. And the Duke? Well, the Duke was still figuring out what to do with me. Lady Evangeline, he said one morning as he passed the schoolroom. Might I have a word? Miss Thornton nodded approvingly. An excellent time for a break. Lady Evangeline has been working on her Latin translations for 2 hours. I followed him to his study, wondering what fresh crisis I'd apparently caused now. I received an interesting letter this morning, he said, settling behind his desk. From Lady Pemberton. She wanted to know if you were quite well, as you seemed different at the Ashworth memorial service last week. Ah, right. I'd completely forgotten about that social obligation. In the book, it was one of the scenes where Evangeline was paraded around like a performing monkey, shown off just enough to satisfy propriety but otherwise ignored. I'd taken a somewhat different approach. Different how? I asked innocently. According to Lady Pemberton, you engaged her in a 20-minute conversation about agricultural improvements and the economic impact of crop rotation. It was a fascinating discussion, I said. Did you know that Lord Pemberton has increased his estate's yield by nearly 30% through innovative farming techniques? We should consider implementing similar methods on the Somerset property. The Duke stared at me. You discussed crop rotation at a memorial service. Well, we couldn't very well discuss the weather for the entire evening, I pointed out. Besides, Lord Pemberton seemed delighted to find someone who was interested in his work. Most people just nod politely and change the subject. Most people do not expect 8-year-old girls to have opinions about agricultural policy. Their loss, really. 8-year-old girls can be surprisingly insightful when given the chance. He rubbed his temples again. I was starting to think I was single-handedly responsible for his premature aging. Lady Evangeline, he said carefully, while I appreciate your newfound interest in estate management, perhaps we should discuss appropriate topics of conversation for social gatherings, such as music, art, literature appropriate to your age. I considered this. What if I promised to only discuss agriculture with people who bring it up first? And I could probably manage some conversation about literature, though you might not like my opinions. Why wouldn't I like your opinions? Well, for instance, I recently read a collection of romantic poetry that was supposedly suitable for young ladies, and I found most of it to be thinly veiled propaganda promoting the idea that women should be grateful for any male attention, regardless of how poorly they're treated. The silence stretched on for so long, I started counting the ticks of the clock on the mantelpiece. I see, he said finally. I mean, take Lord Byron's work, I continued, warming to my theme. Technically brilliant, but the man had the emotional maturity of a particularly dramatic turnip. All that brooding and angst, it's really just selfishness dressed up as depth. Something flickered in the Duke's eyes. You think brooding is selfish? Oh, absolutely. It's self-indulgent wallowing disguised as complexity. True depth comes from actually dealing with your problems instead of just feeling dramatically sorry for yourself. The flicker became something that might have been amusement. And you've learned this from literature? Literature, observation, and basic common sense. I tilted my head. Why do you ask? No reason, he said, but there was something different in his expression. Something lighter. Perhaps we should arrange for you to have some appropriate books for your age. That would be lovely, as long as appropriate doesn't mean mind-numbing. I'll see what I can do. As I left his study, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The Duke was actually listening to me now, treating me like a person instead of an obligation. It was nice. Of course, I had no idea that I was systematically dismantling everything the universe had planned for his love story. But honestly, given how that story ended, the universe could use some better planning. 2 months into my new life as a competent 8-year-old, Rose Whitmore arrived. I was in the garden practicing my French with Miss Thornton when we heard the commotion. Horses, carriage wheels, and the kind of dramatic sobbing that suggested someone was either dying or starring in a very overwrought play. "What on earth?" Miss Thornton murmured, setting down her book. I knew exactly what on earth. Rose Whitmore, the story's heroine, was making her grand entrance. In the book, she arrived as a governess after her father's death left her penniless. She was supposed to be humble, grateful, and irresistibly attractive to brooding dukes. Probably someone looking for employment, I said casually. Shall we go see? We made our way around to the front of the house, where a shabby carriage had deposited a young woman who was crying into a handkerchief. with the kind of theatrical flair that suggested she'd practiced in front of a mirror. She was exactly as described in the book. Golden hair, violet eyes, and a figure that managed to look appealing even in morning dress. The kind of beauty that made men write terrible poetry and challenge each other to duels. The Duke had emerged from the house and was standing on the front steps, looking distinctly uncomfortable with the emotional display happening on his doorstep. "Miss Whitmore, I presume," he said. "Oh, Your Grace," she sobbed, sinking into a curtsy that somehow managed to be graceful despite her apparent distress. "I cannot thank you enough for considering my application. I know I'm quite unworthy of such a position, but I promise you won't regret." "Yes, quite," the Duke interrupted, clearly desperate to get the crying woman out of public view. "Mrs. Hartwell will show you to your quarters." Rose looked up at him with those famous violet eyes, and I saw the exact moment when the story was supposed to begin. The moment when the Duke was meant to be struck by her beauty and begin his slow descent into romantic obsession. Instead, he looked mildly concerned and slightly impatient. "Your Grace," Rose said softly, "might I ask? That is, I was told there was a young lady in need of instruction." "Indeed. Lady Evangeline is my ward. You'll meet her tomorrow when lessons begin." Rose's gaze swept the area and landed on me. In the book, this was where she was supposed to see the neglected, timid child and immediately feel protective and nurturing. "Lady Evangeline?" she said, smiling warmly. "What a lovely young lady." I gave her my most polite smile. "Miss Whitmore, welcome to Blackthorn Manor. I do hope your journey wasn't too arduous." She blinked, clearly taken aback by my formal tone. "Oh, no, quite pleasant, thank you." "Excellent. I look forward to working with you. I should mention that I'm currently studying Latin, French, mathematics, natural sciences, and estate management. I hope that won't be a problem." The silence that followed was telling. Rose looked confused, the Duke looked resigned, and Miss Thornton looked proud. "Estate management?" Rose asked weakly. "Among other subjects, I find it important to prepare for my future responsibilities." I tilted my head. "What subjects did you specialize in during your own education?" Well, the usual accomplishments. Music, watercolors, a bit of French." "How lovely. Perhaps you could assist with my music lessons?" "Miss Thornton is wonderful, but she's the first to admit that her piano skills are somewhat limited." Yes, of course." Poor Rose, she'd been expecting a meek, mistreated child she could mother and protect. Instead, she'd gotten a miniature adult who was clearly more educated than she was. The Duke stepped in to rescue her from the conversation. "Mrs. Hartwell, please show Miss Whitmore to the governess quarters. Miss Thornton, perhaps you could explain Lady Evangeline's current curriculum." As the adults sorted themselves out, I caught Rose watching me with a puzzled expression. She was probably wondering why I wasn't living up to my reputation as the house's resident victim. That evening, I was summoned to dinner. Another recent development. Previously, Evangeline had eaten alone in the nursery. Now I dined with the Duke, which gave us a chance to discuss my day and argue about current events. "Miss Whitmore seems nice," I said carefully as we worked through the soup course. Indeed, the Duke's tone was neutral. "Very beautiful." I hadn't noticed. I nearly choked on my soup. In the book, he'd been instantly smitten. "Really?" "Because she's objectively quite striking. The kind of beauty that launches ships and topples kingdoms." "If you say so." This was fascinating. "Your Grace, might I ask what you look for in people generally?" He raised an eyebrow. An odd question. "I'm curious about human nature. For instance, do you value beauty over intelligence? Agreeability over authenticity? What qualities do you find most admirable?" Why this sudden interest in my preferences? "Educational purposes," I said innocently. "I'm trying to understand what makes people compatible." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "I suppose I value intelligence, the ability to engage in meaningful conversation. Independence of thought. Interesting. And beauty? Beauty fades. Intelligence does not." I sat back in my chair, processing this. In the book, The Duke had been drawn to Rose precisely because she was beautiful and helpless. But this Duke, the one I'd been systematically training to value competence over compliance, apparently had different priorities. "What about agreeability?" I pressed. "Do you prefer people who never contradict you? Contradiction can be refreshing when it's well-reasoned." I grinned. "In that case, I have some thoughts about your investment strategy that you might find interesting." The laugh that escaped him was so unexpected I nearly dropped my spoon. "Of course you do," he said, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely amused. "Very well, Lady Evangeline. After dinner, you may present your thoughts on my investment strategy." "Excellent. I think you'll find I have some innovative ideas about diversification." As we continued our meal, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The Duke was becoming someone I actually liked. Someone who valued intelligence and independent thinking. Someone who laughed at 8-year-old financial advisors instead of dismissing them out of hand. It was a shame, really, that the universe had apparently planned for him to fall head over heels for a woman whose idea of intellectual discourse was discussing the weather. But then again, the universe hadn't counted on me. The next morning brought what I like to call the great governess confusion of 1823. Miss Thornton and Rose had apparently spent the evening trying to figure out how to divide my education between them, and the results were interesting. "Lady Evangeline," Miss Thornton announced as I entered the schoolroom, "Miss Whitmore and I have discussed your curriculum." Rose stood beside her, looking like she'd spent the night reconsidering her career choices. "Yes, well, Miss Thornton explained your advanced studies." "And?" I asked, settling into my usual chair. "We've decided that Miss Whitmore will handle your music and art instruction, while I continue with your academic subjects." I looked between them, sensing undercurrents I couldn't quite identify. "That sounds perfectly reasonable. Miss Whitmore, what instrument would you like to start with?" I play the pianoforte." "Excellent. I've always wanted to learn. Though I should warn you, I tend to ask a lot of questions. For instance, I'm curious about the mathematical relationships in musical harmony, how the ratios between notes create pleasing sounds." Rose blinked. "Mathematical relationships? Oh yes, it's fascinating. Music is essentially applied mathematics. The frequency ratios that create octaves, fifths, and other intervals follow precise mathematical principles." Miss Thornton was smiling behind her book. Rose looked like she was reconsidering her life choices. "Perhaps," Rose said weakly, "we should start with something simpler." "Of course, though I should mention that I learn quite quickly, so we probably won't need to spend too much time on basics." 3 hours later, Rose stumbled out of the music room looking shell-shocked. I'd indeed learned quickly. So quickly that I'd progressed from simple scales to asking pointed questions about musical theory, composition techniques, and the historical development of keyboard instruments. "How did it go?" Miss Thornton asked innocently. She asked me to explain the difference between Baroque and classical compositional styles," Rose said faintly. "And then she wanted to know about Bach's use of mathematical principles in his fugues." "Ah," Miss Thornton said. "And did you explain it?" "I don't know. I mean, I can play the pieces, but I've never really thought about—" Rose trailed off, looking lost. I felt a bit sorry for her. It wasn't her fault that she'd been educated to be decorative rather than analytical, but it was becoming increasingly clear that she and I were going to have some fundamental compatibility issues. "Miss Whitmore," I said gently, "perhaps we could approach this differently. You could play pieces you enjoy, and I could research the theoretical background myself. That way, you can focus on technique and interpretation while I handle the academic side." She looked so relieved I thought she might cry again. Yes, that sounds wonderful. Excellent, though I do have one small request." "Yes? Could we perhaps avoid pieces that are too sentimental? I find excessive emotional drama in music rather tiresome." Miss Thornton made a small choking sound that might have been suppressed laughter. "Sentimental?" Rose asked. "You know, the kind of music that's all weeping and sighing and woe is me. I prefer pieces with more intellectual complexity. Bach, for instance, or Beethoven's later works. Rose nodded slowly, though she looked like I'd just asked her to explain quantum physics. After she left, Miss Thornton closed her book and looked at me with something that might have been pride. "Lady Evangeline," she said, "I believe you may have just revolutionized the concept of musical education." I certainly hope so. The idea that artistic appreciation requires willful ignorance has always struck me as rather backwards. Indeed, though I suspect Miss Whitmore may need some time to adjust to your approach. Probably. She seems nice enough, just not particularly scholarly. Miss Thornton was quiet for a moment. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "What do you think of Miss Whitmore, generally speaking?" I considered the question. Rose was beautiful, kind-hearted, and probably perfectly pleasant to be around if you didn't expect too much in the way of intellectual stimulation. In other words, she was exactly what most men of this era were looking for in a wife. But not, apparently, what the Duke was looking for. At least, not anymore. "She's lovely," I said finally. "But I think she might be happier with someone who appreciates her particular talents. Such as someone who values beauty and agreeability over analytical thinking. Someone who wants a wife who'll smile and nod and never challenge his opinions." Miss Thornton's eyes sharpened. "And you don't think His Grace is such a person?" "Not anymore," I said, then paused. "Was he, before?" "Perhaps. It's difficult to say. He's changed considerably since you arrived." "Changed how?" "He laughs more," Miss Thornton said simply. "He asks questions. He seems interested in things beyond his correspondence and ledgers." I felt a warm glow of satisfaction. That's good, isn't it? Very good. Though I suspect it may complicate Miss Whitmore's situation. How so? Miss Thornton gave me a look that suggested she knew exactly what I was doing. "I think you know perfectly well. How so, Lady Evangeline?" Over the next few weeks, I watched with growing amusement as the universe's carefully planned romance began to crumble like a poorly constructed house of cards. Rose, bless her heart, was trying her absolute best to fulfill her role as the enchanting governess who would sweep the brooding Duke off his feet. She wore her prettiest dresses to dinner, laughed musically at his comments, and gazed at him with those famous violet eyes whenever she thought no one was looking. The problem was that the Duke had apparently become immune to her charms, where the book described him becoming increasingly infatuated with her beauty and gentle nature. This version of him seemed politely indifferent. "Miss Whitmore," he said one evening after she'd spent 10 minutes discussing the weather in elaborate detail, "have you read any interesting books lately?" "Oh," she said, brightening, "I've been reading a most romantic novel about a governess who falls in love with her employer. It's quite touching." "I see. And what did you think of the author's treatment of the class differences between the characters?" Rose blinked. "The class differences, the social and economic barriers that would make such a relationship problematic. Did the author address them realistically?" "Well, love conquers all, doesn't it?" she said with a nervous laugh. The Duke looked like he was reconsidering the whole concept of love. "Lady Evangeline," he said, turning to me, "you've been quiet this evening. What are your thoughts on the matter?" I set down my fork, considering. "Well, Your Grace, I think the love conquers all narrative is rather naive. Love might be a starting point, but practical compatibility matters more in the long run. Shared values, intellectual equality, mutual respect, those are what sustain a relationship when the initial infatuation fades." Rose looked at me like I'd just spoken in ancient Greek. "An interesting perspective," the Duke said. "And where did you learn about relationship dynamics?" "Observation, mostly. And reading. Jane Austen is particularly insightful on the subject. She writes about marriages based on mutual esteem and affection, rather than just romantic passion." "You've read Jane Austen?" Rose asked, sounding slightly scandalized. "Of course. Pride and Prejudice is an excellent study in how first impressions can be misleading, and how true compatibility requires looking beyond surface attractions. The Duke was watching me with that expression I'd come to recognize, the one that meant he was genuinely interested in what I had to say. "And what conclusions have you drawn from Miss Austen's work?" he asked. "That the best relationships are partnerships between equals. Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy work because they challenge each other intellectually. They're both intelligent, principled people who make each other better. Whereas relationships based purely on physical attraction or social convenience tend to end badly. Look at Lydia and Wickham, or even Charlotte Lucas and Mr. Collins. Functional perhaps, but hardly fulfilling." Rose was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of our conversation. "But surely romantic feeling must count for something." "Oh, absolutely," I agreed. "But it should be based on genuine admiration for the person's character and mind, not just their appearance or their ability to be agreeable." The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. "Lady Evangeline," the Duke said finally, "you have a remarkably mature understanding of human relationships for someone your age." "Thank you, Your Grace, though I suspect my perspective might change as I gain more experience. Perhaps, though I find your current insights quite illuminating." After dinner, Rose cornered me in the hallway. "Lady Evangeline," she said, her voice strained. "Might I have a word?" "Of course, Miss Whitmore." She led me to the small sitting room and closed the door behind us. "I couldn't help but notice that you and His Grace have very intense conversations." "We discuss books and ideas," I said innocently. "I find him quite intelligent." "Yes, but," she paused, wringing her hands, "don't you think it might be more appropriate for you to focus on subjects suitable for a young lady your age? Such as music, art, needlework. Pleasant topics that don't require such analytical discussion." I studied her face, seeing the genuine distress there. She wasn't being malicious. She was just completely out of her depth. "Miss Whitmore," I said gently, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. What do you hope to gain from your position here?" She flushed. "I hope to provide you with a proper education, naturally." "And beyond that?" Her flush deepened. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. And I think you should know that His Grace values intelligence above all other qualities. If you want to engage his interest, you'll need to engage his mind." "But I don't have your education." "End of prens. You're 8 years old. You have 14 years of additional experience to draw from. Use it." She stared at me. "You're trying to help me be their best selves, including you." Period. It wasn't entirely true. I was mostly trying to prevent the toxic relationship described in the book, but it wasn't entirely false either. Rose seemed like a decent person who deserved better than being trapped in a doomed romance with someone who would never truly appreciate her. What if my best self isn't intellectual enough? Then perhaps His Grace isn't the right person for you, I said honestly. "But you won't know until you try to be authentically yourself instead of what you think he wants." After she left, I reflected on the strange position I found myself in. In the original book, Rose and the Duke's relationship had been passionate, but ultimately destructive. They'd brought out the worst in each other, his arrogance and her insecurity, creating a toxic cycle that hurt everyone around them. By changing the fundamental dynamic, I was potentially saving them both from a great deal of misery. The question was, what would replace the universe's original plan? But that, I decided, was a problem for future Emma. Present Emma had Latin conjugations to memorize. 3 weeks later, Rose made her move. I was in the library, working on a particularly challenging translation, when she approached the Duke with what was clearly a prepared speech. "Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I wondered if I might speak with you about Lady Evangeline's progress." He looked up from his correspondence. "Of course, please. Sit." She perched on the edge of the chair, hands folded primly in her lap. "She's quite remarkable, isn't she?" "Indeed she is. So intelligent, so well-read, quite mature for her age. Quite." I could see where this was going, and I had to admire her strategy. If she couldn't compete with me intellectually, She'd try to use me as a conversation starter. I confess, Rose continued, I sometimes feel quite inadequate in comparison. She asked such sophisticated questions during our music lessons. I'm sure you're doing your best. I am, but, well, I fear my education was rather limited. I was taught to be agreeable rather than analytical. The Duke's attention sharpened. This was the first time Rose had shown any self-awareness about her intellectual limitations. And how do you feel about that? He asked. Frustrated, she admitted. I see how much you enjoy your conversations with Lady Evangeline, and I wish I could contribute something more meaningful. What would you like to contribute? She took a deep breath. I've been reading, trying to educate myself. I started with the books you recommended to Lady Evangeline. And I find I have opinions about things I've never considered before. Despite myself, I was impressed. Rose was actually trying to grow as a person instead of just expecting the world to accommodate her limitations. What sort of opinions? The Duke asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. Well, for instance, I've been reading about the working conditions in the textile mills, and I find myself quite angry about the treatment of women and children in those factories. Angry? Yes, angry. I know it's not very ladylike, but the more I read, the more I think that some things are worth being angry about. The Duke leaned back in his chair, studying her. What do you think should be done about it? I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I'd like to learn more. Perhaps we could discuss it sometime. I value your opinion. And there it was, the moment when Rose stopped trying to be what she thought he wanted and started being authentically herself. It was rather touching, actually. I would enjoy that very much, the Duke said, and I could feel real warmth in his voice for the first time since she'd arrived. From my corner, I watched this exchange with mixed feelings. On one hand, I was genuinely pleased that Rose was developing as a person. On the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching the beginning of something that could still go very wrong. The original books of problems hadn't just been about Rose's intellectual inadequacy. They'd been about fundamental incompatibilities in temperament and values. Rose was passionate and emotional. The Duke was controlled and rational. She needed constant reassurance. He valued independence. She thrived on drama. He preferred stability, period. But maybe, just maybe, if they approached each other as equals, instead of falling into the typical pattern of brooding lord and helpless governess, they could avoid the worst of those pitfalls. Lady Evangeline, the Duke said, noticing me for the first time. You've been very quiet. What are your thoughts on Miss Whitmore's reading recommendations? I set down my book, considering my words carefully. I think it's admirable when people challenge themselves to grow beyond their original circumstances, and I think meaningful change requires both intellectual understanding and emotional investment. Period. Meaning that Miss Whitmore's anger about injustice is just as valuable as her newfound analytical skills. You need both the heart and the mind engaged to create real change. Period. Rose looked at me with something like gratitude. The Duke looked thoughtful. An interesting perspective, he said. Though I would argue that emotion without rational thought often leads to misguided action. True, I agreed. But rational thought without emotional investment often leads to no action at all. You need both. Like a partnership, Rose said suddenly. One person's strengths complementing the other's. The Duke's eyes met hers, and for the first time, I saw something that might have been genuine interest instead of polite tolerance. Precisely, he said. I excused myself shortly after, leaving them to continue their conversation. As I walked back to my room, I reflected on the strange turns my life had taken. I'd come into this story determined to save little Evangeline from her fate as everyone's favorite victim. Somehow, I'd ended up playing matchmaker to the main characters. Though to be fair, I was playing matchmaker to versions of the main characters who might actually have a chance at happiness. Rose was developing intellectual curiosity and emotional maturity. The Duke was learning to value authenticity over compliance. If they could build a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine compatibility, instead of melodramatic passion and toxic codependency, they might actually work. The question was whether the universe would let them. 2 months later, the universe decided to remind me that I wasn't the only one with a role to play in this story. Lord Marcus Ashwood arrived on a Tuesday, and I knew immediately who he was supposed to be. Tall, fair-haired, and devastatingly handsome in that particularly English way. He was the book's secondary male character, the charming rogue who was meant to complicate the romance by pursuing Rose and bringing out the Duke's jealous possessiveness. In the original story, he'd also been the one responsible for most of Evangeline's suffering. He was her cousin, heir to her father's title, and he'd spent the entire book trying to get control of her inheritance through various underhanded schemes. "Your Grace," he said, sweeping into the drawing room with the kind of theatrical flair that suggested he'd practiced the entrance. "How delightful to see you again." The Duke's expression was carefully neutral. "Lord Ashwood, this is unexpected." I was in the area and thought I'd pay my respects, and of course, see how my dear little cousin is faring. His gaze found me, and I saw the exact moment when he realized I wasn't going to be the easy target he'd expected. I was sitting in a chair by the window, reading a book on estate management, and I looked up at him with polite interest, rather than the fearful deference he was probably used to. "Cousin Evangeline," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "How grown up you look." "Lord Ashwood," I replied pleasantly, "how lovely to see you again. Though I should mention that I don't actually remember you very well. I was quite young when we last met." Of course, you were just a baby then." "Indeed, but I've learned so much since then, about family and inheritance law and the responsibilities of guardianship." I smiled sweetly. It's amazing what a proper education can accomplish. The silence that followed was tense enough to cut with a knife. "Yes, well," Lord Ashwood said, recovering his composure, "I'm sure His Grace has been most attentive to your education." "Extraordinarily so. In fact, I've become quite involved in the management of my own affairs. It's fascinating how much there is to learn about property law and investment strategies." The Duke was watching this exchange with interest, and I could see him beginning to understand the subtext. "Perhaps," Lord Ashwood said, "we might have a private conversation? I have some family matters to discuss." "Of course," I said cheerfully, "though I should mention that His Grace is my legal guardian, so any family matters concerning me should probably include him. Transparency is so important in these situations, don't you think?" Lord Ashwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Naturally, though surely some matters are best discussed within the family, such as your father's estate, for instance. There are certain complications that have arisen." I set down my book and gave him my full attention. "What sort of complications?" "Legal matters, quite complex. Perhaps too complex for someone your age to fully understand." "Try me," I said sweetly. The look he gave me could have curdled milk. "Very well. There's some question about the validity of certain documents related to your inheritance. Some irregularities that may require investigation." I felt a chill run down my spine. This was exactly how it had started in the book. Vague accusations about irregularities that had eventually led to years of legal battles and Evangeline's inheritance being tied up in courts. "What sort of irregularities?" the Duke asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Nothing definitive, you understand. Just some questions about the witnesses to certain documents, the signatures, that sort of thing." "I see," I said calmly. "And who exactly is raising these questions?" "My solicitors have been reviewing the family papers, and they've identified some concerns." "How diligent of them. And what precisely are they concerned about?" Lord Ashwood's smile became strained. "As I said, it's quite complex. Legal technicalities that would bore you terribly." "Oh, I doubt that. I find legal matters quite fascinating. In fact, I've been studying property law with my governess." Did you know that inheritance disputes are often used as a tool to intimidate rightful heirs into accepting unfavorable settlements? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Are you implying something, Lady Evangeline? Lord Ashwood asked, his voice sulky with menace. Oh, goodness no, I said innocently. I'm simply sharing something I learned in my studies. It's amazing how much you can learn about human nature through legal case studies. The Duke stood up, and something in his posture suggested that Lord Ashwood had just made a very serious mistake. Lord Ashwood, he said, his voice perfectly controlled, I think it would be best if you discussed these concerns with my solicitors. They can review whatever questions your legal team has raised and respond appropriately. Of course, Lord Ashwood said, though his smile had become more of a grimace. Though I do think it would be in everyone's best interest to resolve this matter quietly. Family disputes can be so unpleasant. Indeed they can, the Duke agreed, particularly when they involve attempts to defraud children of their rightful inheritance. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Lord Ashwood's mask at civility finally slipped. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. I'm sure you do, the Duke replied calmly. In fact, I'm quite certain you know exactly what I mean. After Lord Ashwood left, with considerably less theatrical flair than he'd arrived with, the Duke turned to me with something that might have been admiration. That, he said, was expertly handled. Thank you, though I suspect this is just the beginning. Undoubtedly. He'll be back with lawyers and documents and all manner of legal maneuvering. I nodded. In the meantime, perhaps we should have your solicitors conduct their own review of my inheritance documents, just to be prepared. Already planned. I'll send word to London tomorrow. Excellent. Oh, and your Grace? Yes. When he comes back, and he will come back, he'll probably try to drive a wedge between us. Make you doubt my legitimacy. Or suggest that I'm being manipulative. Standard tactics for this sort of thing. The Duke looked at me for a long moment. Lady Evangeline, he said finally, I have spent the last several months watching you grow into one of the most remarkable young women I've ever encountered. If your cousin thinks he can convince me that you're anything other than extraordinary, he's gravely mistaken. I felt a warm glow of affection for this man who'd somehow become both my guardian and my friend. Thank you, I said. That means more to me than you know. As he left the room, I reflected on how much had changed since my arrival in this story. The Duke who'd once ignored Evangeline's suffering was now prepared to go to war to protect her inheritance. Rose was developing into someone worth knowing, and I was no longer the helpless victim of other people's machinations. Lord Ashwood had no idea what he was up against. Chapter 10. The Counterattack. Lord Ashwood's return 3 weeks later was considerably less dramatic than his first appearance. This time, he arrived with a team of lawyers and a briefcase full of documents that he clearly expected to be devastating. He hadn't counted on the fact that I'd spent those 3 weeks turning into a one-person legal research department. Your Grace, I said as we gathered in the library for what amounted to a formal legal proceeding. Before we begin, might I present some documents of my own? The Duke raised an eyebrow. What sort of documents? Oh, just some research I've been doing. Family trees, property records, witness statements, that sort of thing. I smiled sweetly at Lord Ashwood, who was looking distinctly uncomfortable. I find genealogy fascinating, don't you, cousin? Lord Ashwood's lead solicitor, a thin man named Mr. Grimsby, cleared his throat. Lady Evangeline, while we appreciate your enthusiasm, these proceedings require legal expertise that— Of course, I interrupted, cheerfully. That's why I've been corresponding with Mr. Whitfield. The silence that followed was profound. Mr. Whitfield? The Duke asked. Jeremy Whitfield. He's considered one of London's foremost experts in inheritance law. Brilliant man. We've been having the most fascinating discussions about fraudulent claims and the legal remedies available to victims of attempted inheritance theft. Lord Ashwood had gone pale. Mr. Grimsby looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. You've been corresponding with Jeremy Whitfield? Mr. Grimsby asked weakly. Oh yes, he was quite intrigued by my situation. Apparently, cases involving attempts to defraud orphan children are something of a specialty of his. He takes them quite personally. I pulled out a thick folder of documents. He's been helping me research similar cases. Did you know that in 1820, Lord Pemberton was prosecuted for attempting to falsify inheritance documents? He spent 3 years in prison. Lord Ashwood made a choking sound. And then there's the Hartwell case from 1818, I continued conversationally. Another cousin trying to claim an inheritance through forged documents. He lost not only the case, but also had to pay substantial damages to the rightful heir. Lady Evangeline, Mr. Grimsby said desperately, these historical cases have no bearing on. Oh, but they do, I said, opening my folder. You see, Mr. Whitfield helped me identify the common patterns in these types of fraud attempts. For instance, they almost always involve questioning the validity of witness signatures on documents that were executed years earlier. I pulled out a sheet of paper. Like my father's will, which was witnessed by 3 people, the family solicitor, the parish priest, and Lord Pemberton, who, incidentally, is still alive and quite willing to testify about the circumstances. Lord Ashwood was now the color of old parchment. They also typically involve challenging the competency of the deceased at the time the documents were signed, I continued. Though that's rather difficult to do when there are multiple witnesses and extensive correspondence showing that my father was in full possession of his faculties right up until his death. I pulled out another document. This is a letter he wrote to his solicitor just 2 days before he died, discussing provisions for my education and the management of my estate. His handwriting is perfectly steady, his reasoning is clear, and it's witnessed by 2 people. Mr. Grimsby was now frantically shuffling through his own papers, looking increasingly desperate. Finally, I said, these attempts almost always rely on the assumption that the rightful heir is too young or inexperienced to understand what's happening. They count on confusion and intimidation to force unfavorable settlements. I smiled brightly at Lord Ashwood. Unfortunately for some people, I'm neither confused nor intimidated. The Duke was trying very hard not to smile. Lady Evangeline, this is quite impressive research. Thank you. Mr. Whitfield was very thorough in his explanations. Oh, and he mentioned that he'd be delighted to represent me if any formal challenges to my inheritance were to arise. Pro bono, he said, since he finds these cases so intellectually stimulating. Lord Ashwood finally found his voice. This is preposterous. You're 8 years old. Indeed I am, I said cheerfully. But my age doesn't make my inheritance any less legitimate. In fact, it makes attempts to defraud me considerably more legally problematic. Mr. Grimsby closed his briefcase with a snap. Lord Ashwood, perhaps we should reconsider our approach. What approach? I asked innocently. You haven't actually presented any evidence yet. I was rather looking forward to seeing these mysterious irregularities you've discovered. The silence stretched on until it became uncomfortable. Of course, I continued conversationally. If you were to decide that there aren't actually any irregularities worth pursuing, I'm sure everyone would be quite understanding. After all, family relationships are complicated, and sometimes misunderstandings arise. I leaned forward slightly. Though I should mention that Mr. Whitfield did explain the legal consequences for making fraudulent inheritance claims. Apparently, the courts take a very dim view of such things. Lord Ashwood and his solicitor exchanged a long look. Perhaps, Mr. Grimsby said carefully, we have been overly cautious in our review of the documents. Upon further consideration, the irregularities we identified may not be as significant as we initially believed. How fortunate, I said. I'm so glad we could clear this up without any unpleasantness. Lord Ashwood stood up abruptly. This isn't over. I certainly hope it is, I replied pleasantly. Though if it's not, I'm sure Mr. Whitfield will be very interested to hear about it. After they left, the Duke looked at me with something approaching awe. Lady Evangeline, he said. That was masterful. Thank you, though I should confess that I had help. Mr. Whitfield, among others, Miss Thornton has been teaching me about legal research, and Rose actually helped me organize all the documents. Turns out she has excellent organizational skills when she applies herself. And the correspondence with London's most feared inheritance lawyer? I grinned. Oh, that's completely real. He was fascinated by the case. Apparently, Lord Ashwood has something of a reputation for this sort of thing. The Duke sat down heavily in his chair. You realize you've just prevented what could have been years of legal battles? I certainly hope so, though I suspect Lord Ashwood will think twice before trying this again with anyone else's inheritance. Indeed he will. The Duke looked at me with obvious pride. You've grown into quite a formidable young woman. Thank you. Though, to be fair, I had excellent teachers. Speaking of which, he said, I believe this calls for a celebration. Perhaps we should invite Miss Whitmore to join us for dinner. I'd like to thank her for her assistance. As he left to extend the invitation, I reflected on how satisfying it was to see a plan come together. Lord Ashwood had been neutralized. My inheritance was secure, and I'd managed to do it all without anyone getting hurt. Well, except for Lord Ashwood's pride and his reputation among London's legal community. But honestly, he'd had that coming. Lady Evangeline, Miss Thornton said, looking up from the letter she was reading, you have correspondence from Oxford. I set down my book, a fascinating treatise on agricultural innovations, and accepted the letter with curiosity. The seal was official, the paper expensive. Oxford? The Duke asked from his position by the window, where he'd been reading his own correspondence. It appears, I said, scanning the letter, that Professor Hamilton has heard about my work on estate management and legal reform. He's inviting me to give a guest lecture next year. A guest lecture? Rose looked up from her embroidery, eyes wide. At Oxford? Apparently so, though I'll be 9 by then, which seems rather young for university lectures. The Duke was smiling. I suspect Professor Hamilton is less concerned with your age than with your expertise. Over the past 6 months, I'd somehow become something of a minor celebrity in intellectual circles. My correspondence with Mr. Whitfield had led to introductions to other legal scholars, which had led to discussions about inheritance law reform, which had led to a rather well-received paper on the legal rights of orphan children. Miss Thornton had submitted it to a legal journal without telling me, and the response had been unexpected. Will you accept? She asked. I think so, though I'll need to prepare extensively. University audiences can be quite demanding. Rose laughed. I think you'll manage. After all, you've been preparing for intellectual challenges your entire life. It was true, in a way. Though my entire life in this world had only been 9 months, they'd been 9 months of intensive learning and growth. The Duke and Rose had announced their engagement 3 months ago, and I was delighted to say that their relationship bore no resemblance to the toxic mess described in the original book. They challenged each other intellectually, supported each other's goals, and seemed genuinely happy together. Rose had blossomed under the Duke's encouragement, developing strong opinions about social reform and women's education. She'd even started writing articles for progressive periodicals under a pseudonym. The Duke, meanwhile, had become someone I actually enjoyed spending time with, witty, thoughtful, and refreshingly willing to admit when he was wrong. Speaking of preparations, he said, I have some news that might interest you. Oh, Lord Pemberton has invited you to visit his estate next month. He wants to show you his new crop rotation system. I perked up with interest. Really? His work on soil improvement has been fascinating. Indeed, though I suspect he's also hoping to learn from your insights. Your ideas about sustainable farming practices have been making quite an impression. It was strange to think that I'd gone from being the story's favorite victim to being consulted on agricultural policy by peers of the realm. But then again, nothing about this experience had gone according to plan. Lady Evangeline, Rose said, setting down her embroidery. Might I ask you something? Of course. When you were younger, well, younger than you are now, did you ever imagine your life would turn out like this? I considered the question. The truth was that 9 months ago, I'd been a 22-year-old college student who'd never given much thought to estate management or legal reform. Now I was a 9-year-old expert on inheritance law who corresponded with university professors and advised lords on farming techniques. No, I said honestly, I thought my life would be much more conventional. And are you happy with how unconventional it's become? I looked around the room at these people who'd become my family. Miss Thornton, who'd nurtured my intellectual growth. Rose, who'd grown from a vapid beauty into someone worth knowing. And the Duke, who'd transformed from a distant guardian into someone I genuinely loved. Yes, I said, I think I am. And I was. I'd come into this story planning to save little Evangeline from her fate as everyone's punching bag. Instead, I'd somehow managed to save everyone, including myself. The original story had been about beautiful people destroying each other through pride and stubbornness. This version was about people growing and changing and becoming better versions of themselves. It was, I thought, a much better story. Excellent, the Duke said, returning his attention to his correspondence. Because I just received a letter from the Royal Agricultural Society. They want you to join their committee on land reform. I blinked. They want a 9-year-old on their committee? They want Lady Evangeline Ashworth, expert on inheritance law and agricultural innovation, on their committee. The fact that you happen to be 9 is merely incidental. Rose laughed. I don't think there's anything incidental about Evangeline. Miss Thornton nodded approvingly. Indeed, I've never met anyone who could turn an inheritance dispute into a masterclass on legal research, or a music lesson into a dissertation on mathematical theory, Rose added, or a casual dinner conversation into an economic policy discussion, the Duke concluded. I felt a warm glow of satisfaction. I'd not only escaped the fate of the original Evangeline, I'd created something entirely new and wonderful. Well, I said, picking up my book again, if we're going to revolutionize agricultural policy and legal reform, we should probably get back to work. Always so practical, Rose said fondly. Someone has to be, I replied. After all, we have a world to improve. And we did, one unconventional conversation at a time.